There are very few franchises across media that carry the weight of something like Star Wars. Not gonna lie, that felt like it was gonna be a lot cooler. What I can see here, that clearly nothing is visible. This just hasn't worked at all, so we're gonna chuck the lighting on now. That's right, this is the Media 13 Star Wars month. It has been a long time since we last covered this franchise. I'm excited to get back into it. I've been talking about wanting to do videos on the sequel trilogy for a long time, and now I'm finally willing to put myself in the firing line. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I love the sequel trilogy. That's right, I'm a Disney shill. Sue me. And the whole point of this trilogy of videos is to relay that I like the sequel trilogy. And maybe you don't, that's completely okay. Feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and let's have a nice, calm, civil discussion. I promise I will not throw insults if you don't. We're also dressed as Cal Kestis, that famous character that is definitely in the sequel trilogy. I do have a Kylo Ren cosplay, but it does not fit me all that well. However, if we hit like 20 likes on this video, I will wear it for the next 2. At this point, Star Wars is a defining name in cinema, a cultural landmark. A generational tale passed down like a story told in a camp circle, and in 2015 that very myth was being handed off again, not just to new characters, but to an entirely new era. And with that handoff came expectations that, right from the off, just seemed impossible. Right out of the gate, Episode 7, The Force Awakens, had to be a resurrection. It had to make people believe in the magic of Star Wars again, not out of obligation or nostalgia, but faith. And somehow, at least in my opinion, it did. Okay, so what? It leans on the past and it echoes familiar story choices. I've just realised one of the lights isn't on. That's kind of the point of this film. Part of what I've always found fascinating since starting my journey with this franchise, with this film, that's right, I am a Disney child, is why the film works to begin with. Because beneath the familiar structure is something very real. It's something that's naturally emotional and earnest, and yet bold in its own way. This movie made Star Wars feel like it was coming home again, and I say that as someone who hadn't watched it prior, so I don't really know how much weight that statement holds. I'm going to presume that it holds a lot though. I personally think if you're willing to see past the discourse of the sequel trilogy, there is so much to be enjoyed here. And it all starts with the one that had the hardest job of all, the one that had to bring Star Wars back to life. One of the loudest and most consistent criticisms that's thrown at The Force Awakens is that it's just A New Hope all over again, and yeah, I guess that's kinda right. Structurally, you've got a desert nobody discovering their power, a masked villain obsessed with legacy, a droid carrying vital information, a planet-destroying weapon, and a ragtag group of rebels going up against an authoritarian regime. Here's the thing though, familiarity isn't by any means failure, not when it's done with intention. Not when it understands the emotional weight of what it's revisiting, and especially not when it's being used to guide both the audience and the story into new territory. Because part of what this movie does, and I think this sometimes gets lost in the discourse, is it invites us back into a world. It uses that comfort of repetition to ease us into a future that promises something new. It's not so much about redoing A New Hope as it is about remembering and honouring why that film works to begin with, interpreting the magic through a whole new lens. When Han Solo boards the Millennium Falcon and declares himself home, it's a fucking thesis statement. It's about reclaiming and reconnecting with the past, and in doing so, passing it on. Because what this film does better, maybe more than any other legacy sequel I've seen, is the message that nostalgia only means something if it leads somewhere. It's easy to say that the movie plays it safe, but it's a little harder for some people to admit that safety may have been the entire point of it. Think about the period this movie came out in, not just for the franchise but for the fans as well. Many people had become detached from the franchise, following so much of the material being wiped from the established canon. The Force Awakens had to meet all of that with something universal. It had to earn back the trust of an entire generation, and in some cases, mine included, introduce the magic for the very first time. Now I do understand that some people were just never going to accept this thing. You know, the casting of John Boyega brought out all of the racists in the fandom. The casting of Daisy Ridley in a leading role led to many people outing themselves as blatant misogynists. But to many people, this film works, and while it's not necessarily my personal favourite in the franchise, it's unanimously agreed among fans that this is the strongest of the sequel trilogy. It was a near impossible task, and the way it pulls it off is actually kinda brilliant. It centres the story around emotion. That's what then makes this repetition feel meaningful rather than hollow. It's not just a case of, hey, remember this? It's, hey, do you remember how this felt? And it works because these characters feel new. Yes, they are built on the same narrative framework, but they're complicated in ways that the original trio just never were. At least in the original trilogy. I am well aware that in the expanded material, these original trilogy characters have had a lot of depth. In fact, there is a great essay by a good friend of mine that you should definitely read on the characterization of Luke Skywalker. I think this thing is fantastic. It's easily one of the most in-depth pieces I've ever seen anyone write on a Star Wars character, so you should check that out. The link will be the top line in the description. Rey is emotionally scarred, isolated, and not even sure what she wants out of this. Finn breaks out of the First Order regime and has to learn what it means to have autonomy, and it's honestly the strongest aspect of the film for me. I will obviously be talking more about these movies as the weeks go on, but Finn is easily the biggest fumbled bag of this entire trilogy, and it'll always be a stain on the thing, regardless of how I feel about the movies. Poe, for as little screen time as he gets here, brings that roguish charm with enough sincerity to feel like more than a carbon copy. And Kylo Ren, the man behind the mask, is where it gets really interesting, but we'll get to him at some point. Even Starkiller Base, which could be the easiest target for this, it fits the framework. Yeah, it's another Death Star, good on you for figuring that one out, but in universe, it's the First Order's way of saying we're doing it bigger, louder, and scarier. It's escalation, and more importantly, it gives characters something to overcome in a way that rhymes with the original trilogy, even if it doesn't necessarily reinvent the wheel. And then you have the ending, the moment Rey finds Luke, standing alone, haunted, silent. It ends the movie with a question, with a hand outstretched, with the weight of the past being offered to someone new. And that's what all of this nostalgia builds towards. Not the final destination, but a handoff. A chance to move forward. The Force Awakens doesn't weaponize nostalgia, it humanizes it. It treats it like a memory and uses it to build the bridge between generations. It reminds us how it felt to believe in Star Wars so that we can slowly start to believe in it again. Not because it's the same, but because it still manages to matter. For all the spectacle and the legacy that rides on The Force Awakens, it's the characters that give it the soul. Strip away all of the glamour and what you're left with is a story about people, about loss, identity, fear, and the desperate need to belong. These are the emotional anchors, and they're why the movie works. So let's briefly start with Rey. I won't go into too much detail with her, mainly because a lot of what I want to say has been covered on the channel previously in a video that I made around 2 years ago now, in which I detailed exactly why she's my favourite character in the franchise, and one of my favourites in movies in general. So the link is on the screen somewhere, you can also find it in the description, go check that one out. Rey is a scavenger, left behind on a dead-end planet, holding on to a fantasy that one day someone is gonna come back for her. That is her whole world, and she clings to that belief because the alternative is just too painful for her to accept. What's beautiful to me about her arc is how internal it actually is. As well as discovering the Force, she's discovering her own value, the idea that she's allowed to move forward even if the past doesn't come back. She initially refuses the lightsaber and wants to go home, and watching her progression as she realises that home isn't behind her anymore is a little heartbreaking but also kind of empowering at the same time. And then there's Finn, who, like I said, had the potential to be one of the most interesting Star Wars characters out there if he was not completely butchered past this point. We could have had an all-time great on our hands here, and I will honestly, as much as I love the trilogy, I will never forgive it for that. He is a stormtrooper who defects, choosing compassion over conditioning. That is such a strong premise in the first place, and John Boyega brings so much life to the role. There's this deep-rooted tension in Finn between survival and purpose. He starts out running from the First Order, from the Resistance, from responsibility, but every step that he takes draws him closer to discovering that he has found people who cares about him. Now, found family is a phrase that I haven't mentioned on this channel in a long time, but that concept is the emotional core of The Force Awakens, and Finn is living proof of that. And then you have Kylo, the angry heir, the boy who so desperately wants to be Vader, but can't stop bleeding light. He's a villain in deep conflict because he wants to be evil, but he can't quite commit. That to me is such a compelling reversal. We've seen plenty of dark to light stories in Star Wars, but Kylo is here trying to force the opposite. He's insecure, performative, and trying to wear menace like a mask that seems a little too big for him. And when he takes it off, there's an element of Adam Driver's performance that portrays him as a kid who's in way over his head. He's not an intimidating villain because he's strong, he's intimidating because he's fragile, and that fragility quickly becomes lethal. Speaking of lethality, I think that very neatly brings us on to Han. This is probably my favourite portrayal of Han Solo across the movies, and it's definitely Harrison Ford's best acting in the role in my opinion. We first meet him, and early on he's exactly as we'd expect. Cocky, fast talking, but underneath it you can feel the weight that he's carrying. Harrison Ford plays it with such subdued sadness that you don't really notice it until looking back. His scenes with Leia are brief and yet devastating. You can feel the love, the failure, all of the things left unsaid. It's all done so well that by the time he walks out onto that bridge, you just know what's happening. That moment independently is the emotional pin of this movie. Everything is centred around that. These characters don't just move the movie forward, they move us. They give the film a pulse. They make the story matter because of who they are, because of what they feel. And honestly, that's what I'm gonna remember first. Now, I do want to bring everything down a notch and admit out loud, just so you know that I'm not a complete shill, that yes, I know The Force Awakens is not a perfect movie. While I enjoy a lot of it, I do agree that sometimes it plays it just a little too safe for my liking, and as much as it promises bold new beginnings, it sometimes feels like it's almost a little hesitant to let go of it. Starkiller Base in concept makes sense, and two of the best sequences in the movie happen in this segment, but it is still for me the weakest plot point of the film. Pacing is also something that I had a little issue with. The first half is completely perfect, nothing to complain about there. It's full of momentum, but the third act drags because there is just so much to get through. Finn's confrontation is over with Phasma in seconds. The Resistance base is barely given any depth, and certain character relationships, like Poe and Finn, spark beautifully before stagnating with the hope that it'll pick up in the next film. The Force Awakens sometimes feels a little too focused on being an event that it forgets to sit with the later, quieter moments. But here's why it doesn't ruin it for me. Because despite the formula and the uneven pacing, the movie never once feels cynical. It never feels lazy. Every decision, even the somewhat flawed ones, feel like they're coming from a place of care, of deep emotional investment. And that kind of sincerity is rare, especially in legacy sequels, especially in billion-dollar franchises. You can feel that push and pull between old and new, reverence and reinvention. The Force Awakens is a movie that's trying to honour what came before without losing its own path, and yeah, it stumbles, but it never falls. Because what it gets right, that being the characters, the heart and the feeling, matters way more than anything that it gets wrong. It's easy to forget 10 years later, but The Force Awakens really was a bit of a miracle. The movie had such a difficult job. It had to reignite one of the biggest franchises in cinematic history. It had to try and win back old fans while inviting new ones and somehow balance the future of the saga with what came before. I mean, sure, it didn't do it all perfectly, it made choices that were safe, it left questions to be answered, but even now, what still lingers for me when I rewatch this film is the spark, the feeling, the sense that Star Wars was back as something that mattered again. The Force Awakens for me represents one generation stepping aside to make room for the next. The movie introduces me to characters that I have come to deeply care about. It gave us Finn, it gave us Rey. Kylo is there as well. It's not perfect, and I don't think that was ever trying to be, and I know that is a statement that I make about a lot of films, but I do mean it here. Not that I don't any other time. I know the sequel trilogy is not popular, and I know that I'm not a very popular person right now because I am doing a trilogy of videos that positively frame these things. But if you're mad about this one, just you wait honey, because next week we're covering my favourite Star Wars movie.